Okay, once again, you can download the presentation. I'll be working from www.streaminglearningcenter.com. Scroll down to encoding your video, choosing an enterprise encoder, Europe 2012. Click that, and you can download the attachment here, which has the PDF. A lot of information in this seminar, so I would recommend getting that. Okay, this is me. If you want to write this down, you can email me if you can't find the attachment, and I can send it to you. So we have 45 minutes. We have 45 slides. So I'm going to ask that you hold questions till the end. A lot of information, as I've said. Want to cover up front both what's covered and what's not, because we're not going to spend any time at all on live encoding. So if you're interested in live encoding, you might be able to find a better use of your time. Spend a little bit of time talking about what an enterprise encoder is. How is it different from a desktop encoder? What are the classes of enterprise encoders? And then once you understand the classes, what are the points of differentiation or the factors to consider when choosing an enterprise encoder within each class? And then spend a little bit of time about what's coming in this market segment over the next 3 to 12 months. So I'm going to talk about on-demand only, no live, no video conferencing or conferencing solutions. Focusing primarily on desktop and mobile and compatible markets. The cable and broadcast market for even on-demand and live encoders is different than what you need for streaming and for OTT. And I'm focusing on primarily streaming with some overlap as it relates to the over-the-top market. And then I'm also talking exclusively about local installations. I'm not going to cover cloud encoding as either. So if any of those are what you came to hear, now's a good time to check out. So what is an enterprise encoder? How is Squeeze Server, a tool from Sorensen Media, different from Squeeze, which is a desktop tool that many of us know and love? Similarly, how is Episode Engine different from Episode Pro, which is a $1,000 desktop tool? The differentiation varies by product, but here are some concepts. When I think about an enterprise encoder, I think about products that enabled shared usage, both from watch folders and user interface, but also via an API. So most enterprise encoding tools have an API that allow you to address its encoding capabilities from your content management system, deliver those files to your streaming web system. So the API is very, very key. Some vendors don't enable the highest possible performance on their desktop tools. In particular, that's Telestream. Episode Pro can only encode 2 parallel encodes simultaneously. Episode Engine can do an unlimited amount. Scalable, this is also key. Most desktop systems, Adobe Media Encoder, Sorensen Squeeze, they're standalone systems. You can't really scale them. You can't group them together. There are exceptions. We'll cover those. An enterprise encoder is scalable. You can add multiple nodes and have a single point of control with some level of failover. If one server fails, you can find a way to keep on encoding. So those are key differences between an enterprise and a desktop encoder. Most provide all relevant outputs. That's not 100%. One of the fastest hardware enterprise encoders from Elemental, their server product doesn't do BP6. BP6 is not an absolute requirement for a lot of vendors now, but some people still require it. But they are starting to produce files for HTTP live streaming, HTTP dynamic streaming, smooth streaming, and Dash. So a lot can produce, you put an input file in and you end up with manifest files and the specific content files you need for those particular formats. If I'm thinking enterprise versus desktop, there are very few, if any, desktop products that have any closed captioning capabilities. So a lot of people, particularly in Europe, need closed captioning. None of the desktop tools do that. And most of them also do not support DRM either. Talked a little bit about programmability via application programming interface and plugins. You know, Squeeze Server, the enterprise tool from Sorensen, has an API, Squeeze Desktop doesn't. Episode Engine is one of the only enterprise encoders that doesn't have an API, but it does have a command line interface. Enterprise encoder can be hardware. Here's some pretty prominent hardware systems. It can be software. A lot of people use Harmonic Carbon Coder, Telestream Vantage, and the ATEM product. And it can also be command line. I mean, YouTube uses FFmpeg for their encoding. So you'd be hard-pressed not to call that an enterprise encoder because it encodes more files than all the other encoders combined. Now, from my perspective, enterprise encoders fall into 3 classes, and I think it's important to know which class you're looking for before you start to make a buying decision. So the first class is Swiss Army knife transcoders, where they take all formats in, all formats out. Now, this is really important if you're working with intermediate formats from ProRes or Avid DNX HD. You need the ability to input those formats into an enterprise encoder. Not every enterprise encoder supports all those formats. And in a lot of cases, you may want to input your camera formats and then output an intermediate format for further editing. Not all enterprise encoders do that either, particularly the harder ones. So this is class 1. Class 2 is kind of the high volume encoder. They've got limited I/O support, but they provide the fastest possible H.264 encoding. And the poster child in this class is the Elemental server. Very, very, very fast H.264 encoding, but it doesn't have a lot of input support, doesn't have a lot of output support, just blows through a lot of H.264 files very quickly. And then the third class, I think, is probably the most interesting class, and that's the workflow system category. And this is where you integrate encoding functionality with quality control and other functions. And this, I think, for a lot of producers is where things are going over the next 6 months to 3 years. So what these tools allow you to do is to make encoding decisions based upon metadata. You have one watch folder, and that watch folder will interrogate the header of the file and then place it in an encoding bucket based upon the resolution, based upon the aspect ratio. So it can tell if it's an HD or SD file, it can tell if it's 16 by 9 or 4 by 3, and automatically place that in the appropriate encoding bucket. So I just finished a consulting project for someone who's encoding with Adobe Media Encoder. We had to create 4 different watch folders that the customer has to manually say, okay, what's the frame rate, what's the resolution, and the client has to manually put all those files into the proper watch folder. Now, with a workflow system, it can interrogate the file header and then make that encoding decision for you. It can perform incoming quality control checks, post-encoding quality control checks. If the signal-to-noise ratio is beyond a certain agreed level, you can kick the file out and then say, hey, you better look at this before you publish it. I started looking at these systems when I started doing custom encoding jobs, and it was like, how do you release a file without some measure of quality control? And this particular job was converting 3-hour DVDs to 4 iterations each. So in order to do any kind of quality control manually, I'd have to watch each, you're looking at 12 hours of watching for each source video. So I got really scared about quality control once I started doing a lot of longer encoding projects. And they also offer self-healing workflows so that if you do have a signal-to-noise ratio that's too high, it can re-encode the file at a higher data rate and see if you can get the signal-to-noise ratio at an acceptable level. So I think for a lot of producers, if you're not currently integrating quality control into your workflow, it's something you need to think about doing, and these are the type of systems that can allow you to do it. And this is how it works. This is Carbon Coder. This is one of the prominent, and actually Carbon Coder is a component of the Harmonic workflow system. So the workflow controller sits over here, it gets the files in, it sends it to Carbon Coder here for encoding, does incoming quality control here, outgoing quality control here, and then sends the files out to a playout server or other delivery. In the context of actually doing the work, you build a workflow and you assign a workflow to a watch folder or to a specific job. So in this particular workflow, we're interrogating the file, we're testing for an error. If that error exists, you send me an email and put the file in a folder somewhere. Then you perform the transcodes, and there's 8 transcodes here for adaptive streaming. And then you test for SSIM, it's a quality test, and you test for drop frames. So if there are any drop frames or if the quality isn't sufficient, you send me an email and you quarantine the file. And if the job is successful, then you send the file to the FTP location that you specify in the workflow. So when I talk about a workflow system, this is kind of what I'm talking about. And this is Telestream Vantage. It's another workflow system. The incoming file, and this is the logic. This is how you set up the operations in the system. So this is the incoming file. The first thing it does is get the height. And this asks the question, is it HD or SD? Is it letterboxed or not? And then based upon those questions, it automatically encodes the files with these presets here. Once the files are in codes, it moves it to the designated location. So again, if you're not doing quality control now, I think it's something you need to think about, and the best way to integrate it into your operation is through a system like this. The benefits of a workflow system: you get more sophisticated workflows. You can do you can automate a lot of the manual operations. You also get integrated reporting for encoding and quality control. So you can integrate a quality control system via a watch folder to any existing encoder, but then you get separate reporting. You get separate notifications. It's not as integrated. The main negatives are cost. So the harmonic workflow system costs $20,000 on top of ProMedia encoding software. And Telestream Vantage is $8,500 on top of their encoding and on top of their quality control system. So you buy all the components separately, and you end up investing a whole lot more to get that capability. And they're also reasonably complex. I mean, this kind of stuff is nightmarish for me because I just don't think this way. I'm sure a first-level programmer can put this together very easily, but in terms of how I think, it's nowhere close to that. So from my perspective, what's the point of these descriptions? The 3 types are all very different. So unless you know which type you're going to buy, then you're kind of floating around thinking, well, should I buy that one? Should I buy that one? You're comparing apples against oranges. So here's kind of the great taxonomy. These are the Swiss Army knife systems, a lot of names that you've heard, a lot of names that you've seen. Here are the high volume, primarily hardware encoders, and here are the workflow systems. So these 2 are out. We've seen screens from them, and the Digital Rapids Kayak workflow platform is kind of evolving. I think some components of it are out now, and I think some components are coming. So the first thing I would do in your shoes is I would say, okay, what am I looking for? And then once I understand what I'm looking for, I say, okay, these are the tools within that category that I should be considering. And I think you want to do this analysis first, again, because it'd be kind of silly to compare the elemental server against, harmonic carbon coder. They're just different kind of products that are suitable for different types of workflows and different types of operations. Okay, so now that you've narrowed down the type of product that you're interested in into one of the 3 categories, the question is, how do you differentiate them? And there's literally dozens of products in this category, and there was no way for me to gather precise specifications about all of them. We're going to see a lot of spec sheets, and what I tried to do was identify the issues that I would identify in the various products that I was considering before making a buying decision. Some of the information will help you, some of it will be for informational purposes only, so that you know the questions to ask and the features to consider. And these are the categories that I kind of use to differentiate. So it's input-output, metadata support, including closed captioning, H.264 encoding controls, because I think most of us are interested in H.264 primarily, if not exclusively, the output quality, performance, work row functionality, work group functionality, and then price. So these are all the things that I considered when I was differentiating within the classes that I looked at. So again, this is inputs from a limited number of enterprise systems that are kind of across the groups that we mentioned. But this is the type of thing, I think the first thing, the first thing you need to think about is what input file formats does my system need to comprehend? What are the input formats that I'm working with, both from a container format perspective and a codec perspective, and where are those files? So it's interesting, Elemental Server is one of the best pure encoding solutions out there, but it does not officially handle Avid DNX HD. So if that's the format you're editing in, it's not a very suitable system. Not a lot of people do Cineform. There's a lot of native support for ProRes. NVIDIA Forecaster, it's a French tool, obviously, does not have the ability to look out at remote FTP sites and retrieve files automatically. That's a feature you can build around, but it's something that you prefer to have, something that a lot of other tools can do in all the product classes. So again, in your shoes, I would make a list. What are the container formats I need to encode? What are the codecs I need to encode? Where are the files that I need to encode? And then when you compare the systems, I would make sure that they handle all the container formats and the codecs that you need and can retrieve the files where you need to encode them. Here are the outputs. Again, the big reds here, this is codecs, H.264, MPEG-2, 3GP, VP6. VP6 support is not 100%. 2 years ago, it probably would have been 100%. What container formats are supported? Do you need to create intermediate files so that you can edit them? A lot of hardware systems don't output this type of format. Some do, some don't. So again, list the output formats that you need, and then make sure that the systems you compare can output them. Not only single codecs, but also adaptive delivery. A lot of people have Dash already, or at least some versions of Dash. A lot of people have it coming in 2013 and beyond. And then finally, can the enterprise encoder deliver the file where you need it delivered? Again, FTP. The ability to put a file in an FTP folder remotely is very important if you're a service bureau or if you're serving multiple locations. Not everybody does that. So before you go shopping, make a list of all the output formats you need to support, both single file and adaptive. Make a list of all the places you need to send those files, and make sure that the systems you consider support all those features. This is the closed captioning and advertising insertion. Advertising insertion is down here. Lots of differential in terms of closed captioning. How many people need to support closed captioning at this point? Okay, so some people do, some people don't. If you do, this is critical. If you don't, it's not so important. Here's advertising insertion. Amberfin, surprisingly, does not support it. Sorensen Squeeze Server doesn't. Episode Engine does not. The hardware systems tend to, because they tend to be, they were typically created for broadcasters who needed that functionality before most streaming applications. Okay, and the next segment is H.264 encoding controls. I am not a big fan of having lots of configuration options in my H.264 encoding controls, because I think there's very limited ability to tie them to usable use cases. So there's nobody who says, okay, you've got this configuration option, it works really well if you're encoding some guy standing up in a Sanford sweatshirt in front of a blank wall. You've got all these options, but you have no way to understand when to use them. So what you see in, this is Sorensen Squeeze. They've got the X.264 codec, and their decision was to support every X.264 encoding option that you can access via FFmpeg or the command line. I think this is good. What they did is they allowed you to pick presets that kind of had clumps of these features configured. But here's here's Elemental Server, which is a hardware device that I've tested and reviewed, so I'm familiar with it. And basically, they give you profile level CABAC slices and adaptive quantization on and off, and that's it for your H.264 configuration options. So if you need to tweak, if there's some reason that you need access to a whole range of H.264 encoding controls, don't assume that they're going to be there. It really seems like the more expensive the product, the fewer the controls. I looked at the H.264 encoding engine for the NVIDIA Forecaster product, and it's very similar to this. You get very few controls. It's nothing like this. And really, there's probably less than 1% of users out there who even know what these things do. So to include them in an encoding interface is it's a recipe for disaster. I mean, you're like, yeah. Anyway, so I typically don't recommend messing with these. I don't see this as a big differentiating factor, but again, if you need access to granular controls, don't assume it's going to be there. Quality is the, as you would expect, every encoder vendor claims that their quality is the best. I've done a lot of testing. I've seen very little meaningful differentiation in H.264 encoding quality. And every vendor that I tested obviously said we have the best available H.264 encoding quality. The thing to understand is that if you're encoding at 640 by 360 at 1200 kilobits per second, which is pretty much what a website like CNN or BBC might use, you're not going to see any difference in H.264 quality in any of the encoding tools. This is a relatively high data rate. It's not demanding on the H.264 codec. Quality is going to be very, very similar, if not identical. All high data rate files look great. Here's an example of this. This is Rosette Carbon Coder at 1200 kilobits per second, Episode Engine at 1200 kilobits per second. This is Rosette at 240 kilobits per second, much higher compression. And this is Episode Engine at 240 kilobits per second. This is a talking head, obviously no major differentiation here. This is a ballet sequence, a dancer dancing across the stage. At 1200 kilobits per second, you can see a little bit of difference in color, but there's no real difference in overall quality. And then down here, both of the images are slightly degraded. You'd be hard-pressed to pick a winner. Viewers never see comparison images like this, and they never see them still frame like this. They just see it in real time, one video only. So you'd really hard-pressed to say that this video is meaningfully better than this video, or vice versa. And that's kind of how all my H.264 encoding comparisons come down. Here's another, Episode Engine, 240, 1200, Carbon Coder, 1200, 240, same thing. Indistinguishable, pretty much indistinguishable. So the one thing I will say is that 2 or 3 years ago, Main Concept was the clear leader in H.264 quality in all the tests that I ran. They were better than Apple, they were better than Sorensen. And what I'm seeing now is a general move towards X.264 to find higher quality. And I'm seeing that in Squeeze and Episode, both the desktop versions and the enterprise versions of their program. And you're starting to see a lot more companies internally developing their own codecs. So Elemental has a codec for their server because they needed high-quality GPU encoding. That's kind of how they do their stuff. Harmonic has their own H.264 codec. Atem has their own H.264 codec. So, 2 or 3 years ago, Main Concept was a stamp of quality. Today, it's kind of dropped from that level. So that's H.264. In terms of VP6, again, if you care about VP6, the quality among all the encoders that I tested was pretty much identical. We saw huge performance differences. That's where I based my decision. Who cares about Windows Media? Anybody still producing Windows Media? Okay. I mean, you do see a significant difference in Windows Media. Elemental Server was very poor. Episode Engine was also very poor. So if this format's important, you need to be really careful. And this is Elemental Server, 800 kilobits per second, 720p video. This is ProMedia Carbon, and you see a noticeable difference in quality. Now that's something I would say is meaningfully from a commercial standpoint. All the other differences in H.264 just aren't commercially meaningful. So that's the quality side. H.264, I think you should just count on thinking that it's equivalent. VP6 is equivalent. Performance is a big differentiator. Windows Media, there are real differences. If that's important, you need to watch out. In terms of performance, performance is very, very challenging to measure. It's very easy to measure linear encoding speed, but at the end of the encode cycle, some people deliver HLS files that are chunked and manifest files. Some just deliver the H.264 files. Some, to get to the manifest files, you have to bring it into a separate program. So you can measure linear encoding speed, but it's really hard to understand what the actual time differences are between input and usable output. A couple of other things that make it challenging. Episode Engine can start encoding before a file is fully delivered. So if you have Engine and it's getting a file via remote FTP, it can start encoding it before the file is fully loaded. A system that can't do that basically is going to be, however long it took to transport the file in, it's going to be behind in terms of overall encoding time. So if you're doing a lot of remote file retrieval, Episode Engine can give you a meaningful head start. In Viveo Forecaster, they can take a file in, they produce 3 or 4 iterations or however many iterations you want for adaptive streaming, and it can produce multiple manifest files and multiple chunk files for the different adaptive encoding schemes. So they do that automatically. To do that in Sorensen Squeeze, you'd have to encode each file separately again as an adaptive group. So in Viveo Forecaster, its linear speed is not that great, but its time to usable output speed is very high because it's very efficient in the post-processing of the encoded files. And that's why I'm saying performance is kind of a tough thing to measure, because everybody does things a little bit differently. So having said that, here's the test that I ran, I guess back in May and then updated a few weeks ago. So all tests except for Elemental, which is a GPU hardware device you buy separately, I ran on my 12-core HP Z800. I used 11, we'll see several tests that involved encoding for adaptive streaming. There I produced 11 files without post-processing. So I encoded to H.264, VP6, and VC1, but I didn't take the final step and go out to chunked content for adaptive streaming and producing the manifest files. And I looked at 3 tests, a single file encode of a 1080p file, an 11 file test of a 52-minute 1080p file, and 24 DV files to all 11 presets. This was kind of an administrative test. This was kind of a single file, get it done test, and this is a typical adaptive streaming workflow test here. A lot of information here. This first clump of files, this is H.264. This is what we mostly care about. Single file, 5 minutes. Episode Engine did very well. They used something called split and stitch encoding. They divide the 5-minute file up into 7 or 8 different chunks, encode them separately, and then piece them back together again. Very good if you're encoding a single file to the H.264 output. Carbon was slow here. Squeeze also does split and stitch encoding, but the overall winner was the Elemental Server. Actually, Episode Engine was the overall winner. Elemental wasn't quite as fast, but was up there. And this is 59 seconds. This is 1 minute and 34 seconds. This is 1:21. This is probably the most relevant test out there. 52-minute 1080p file to 11 different presets. This is Episode Engine, ProMedia Carbon. This is a beta product that should hit the market in the next 2 to 3 months. It's called ProMedia Express. It's basically an H.264 encoder only. This is Squeeze Server, and this is Elemental Server here. We see ProMedia Express, which was in beta when I tested it, was very fast at 3610. Elemental Server was the overall winner at 22 minutes, 56 seconds. Now, this is a dual-core, dual GPU encoding tool. They've just announced a quad-core GPU and CPU encoding tool. They said they've run these same tests, and they've halved the encoding time. So those are tests I should be able to duplicate within the next couple weeks, and I'll probably post an updated file for the presentation I give at Streaming Media West in 2 weeks. So look for that. But when we talked about the 3 classes of encoding tool, you know, if you really just need very, very fast H.264 encoding, the GPU acceleration that you get from Elemental is very, very compelling. Not only in the 52 one-to-many test, but also in the 24-minute, 1-minute DV file to 11 different presets. It was 1227 compared to 67 minutes here. You know, you've got 2236. ProMedia Carbon, I was very surprised at that result because usually it's a very, very efficient, very fast encoding program, and it just really couldn't compete not only against the GPU acceleration here, but even against Episode Engine. Okay, this is VP6. As I said, the quality in VP6 encoding systems is relatively equivalent. If you still care about this format, ProMedia Carbon is actually a great tool because it's much faster than both Episode Engine and Squeeze Server. And then Windows Media, big difference in overall quality. Squeeze Server does a nice job, both performance-wise and quality-wise. It beats Episode Engine, which had issues with the quality, and it's reasonably close to Elemental, which also had big issues with the quality as well. Okay, talked about Harmonic ProMedia Express. This is what they have coming. You know, it delivered exceptional H.264 encoding performance. Those are these results right here. But I didn't really test the quality because it wasn't available. You know, all I did was do the encoding. Can't tell you how this is going to come out quality-wise, but it looks promising from a performance perspective. You know, the basic summary is, you know, there are real differences in encoding speed. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of benchmark tests out there. You know, I have the only ones that I'm familiar with. Most of the vendors I know will either run tests or loan you a system. Certainly, the software vendors will give you a trial system, and I would try and run your own performance trials before you purchase because I think there are real both quality differences and performance differences in the various products. So the typical enterprise encoding system is accessed via watch folders, API, or direct UI by a limited user group. You have one system administrator. They do all the, they create the presets. They create the watch folders. What do you do if you have a bunch of editors and they all need access to encoding? Not only encoding, but also configuration. And this is some editing work groups, and workgroup capable encoders can integrate encoding into the producer community. There's 2 basic approaches: clustering, which is Episode Pro and Episode Engine, and then what I call send to functionality, which is Squeeze Server. Let's look at those in more detail. If you have multiple episode users on a local area network, they can cluster their computers together. So you have 5 editors working on a network. If you get them each Episode Pro, if 2 editors go home and then the other 3 need to do big encoding jobs overnight, they can send the encoding job to other units in the cluster. Or if you put one version of Episode Engine on the local area network, they can send jobs to Episode Engine. A very good alternative if you have different people who need access to encoding controls as well as encoding configurations. And then what Squeeze desktop users can do is they can encode jobs locally, or they can send jobs to Squeeze Server. So if you have some editors have Squeeze desktop and you have an installation of Squeeze Server out there, they can encode locally for small jobs they want to get done quickly. They can send the job to Squeeze server for bigger jobs that they want to kind of offload so they can continue to edit. So if you know, a lot of enterprise encoding tools are basically, you just need one place to do all your encoding. If you need spread out functionality in a work group, I think Episode does a good job, and I think Squeeze does a good job. Okay, we all care about pricing. What I tried to do here was look at it two ways. The first one are the various components of both a workflow and standalone encoding systems. And actually, it's not top and bottom anymore. It's first page, second page. The first page is going to be the individual components. The second page is going to be a 5-unit server cost without redundancy. If you need an enterprise encoding system with no single point of failure, what does it cost you for redundancy? And in comparing software systems against hardware systems, I ensued that each encoding station cost $8,000. So Episode Engine is a software-only system. That costs you $3,000, but you got to run it on a computer. I said that computer cost you $8,000. And that I compared against Episode or Elemental Encoder, which is a $26,000 encoding tool, but you don't need to buy a separate computer to run it. Okay, so I had to come up with some base price for the computing side of it. Here are the various components of the enterprise systems that I looked at. The basic encoding systems for Digital Rapids Transcodes Manager was $6,500. If you want to do a server farm, it's another $10,000. The total is $16,500. Elemental, the base unit is $26,000. Don't know what pricing will be on the new version. Workflow is expensive. We talked about that. $20,000 for the workflow software, $6,000 for the encoder, $6,000 for quality control. So one installation of the workflow system from Harmonic is $32,000. Squeeze server, $5,000 per system, and that's it. And then Episode Engine, I guess it's $4,000 per system, and that's here. Vantage Transcode, that's another workflow system, $26,000 for the workflow software, $5,500 for the quality control engine, $7,500 for the, actually it's $55 for the encoding, $7,500 for quality control. Anyway, you guys can read the descriptions as well as I can. Point is, if you want to look at a workflow system, you need to price all the components and recognize they're going to be separate. This is the 5-station encoding farm. Here are encoder license, server farm controllers. This is the total cost without redundancy. And this is the total cost with redundancy. And the takeaway here, very few people, if you're looking at other systems, the components you need to price are the encoder controllers. That's the basic encoder itself. What the server farm controller costs. How many computers are required for both standalone operation control and redundancy. And then again, the computers at $8,000 are factored into the cost. This gives you the base cost. If you need another server controller so there's no single point of failure, this is the additional cost. I know it's a lot of information. You're going to look at different tools than this. Just make sure you get the costs here so you can have an apples-to-apples comparison in the systems that you're considering. Okay, what do I see coming over the next 3 to 12? Telstream Vantage Lightspeed is going to use their workflow software plus GPU accelerated hardware encoding. Elemental server kind of proved the whole concept of GPU encoding, high quality H.264 production. Telestream is the first company to kind of chase Elemental server on the performance side. Harmonic ProMedia Express, that's the very fast microgrid software we saw in the performance chart. They call it microgrid encoding. That should be shipping in the next 3 to 6 months. I think that's going to do very well for H.264 software-only encoding. Digital Rapids Kayak workflow tool, that's coming. And then as we talked about, elemental encoder with the double CPU density and double the performance. So if all you're interested in is really fast H.264 encoding, elemental server is a very, very, very good product. Other resources, I reviewed Elemental. You can find that review here. And I reviewed Episode Engine. You can find that review here. I'll be looking at a couple of other these tools for streaming media in the next few months. Okay, let me, again, a lot of information. If you weren't here when we started, the slides are available at streaminglearningcenter.com. Come down here, encoding your video, choosing an enterprise encoder, and then you can download the presentation on this page in the website. Okay, any questions? I know this is a tough session after lunch, and I apologize for that, but go ahead.
Do you have already made experience in regard to performance for the third-class products, the workflow systems?
Workflow? You know, I've used some of the workflows, but I haven't done any encoder testing. But I've tested, you know, Carbon Coder, which was, you know, frankly disappointing in some of the performance tests I did, especially for H.264. So Carbon Coder is the encoding engine for the harmonic workflow system. So
Is the same the case for Vantage? Is it?
no, I haven't tested the Vantage. I'll be getting the new Vantage system in sometime in November. So I'll be testing it then, and I'll write about it.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Why didn't add expression encoder from Microsoft, which is for H.264?
Okay, why I didn't test the Microsoft encoder? You know, it's not really an enterprise tool. You know, it's a $200 desktop encoder. So I didn't, you know, I've tested that before, but I didn't really see it in this class of product. Any other questions? Yeah. What about Amberfin?
Amberfin, yeah. I just want to make a comment really and just give an insight into why some of the vendors have these huge configuration pages and some of them don't. And it really comes down to the sorts of users who can or can't control their content. If you have a broad range of content and you don't know whether you're putting in sports today or film or user-generated or whatever, the products oriented at those kinds of markets tend to have very simple user interfaces because they try to do the best depending on, well, just what you're given at the time. And one of the advantages of the workflow systems and the big configuration pages is that if you know you're definitely putting movie material through, or you know that you're definitely putting previously broadcast video material through, you can use those big configuration pages and some of the workflow systems or pre-snipping tools to really make a sort of somewhere between 15 and 25% difference on the either the bit rate or the picture quality that goes through the system. And this was struck home to me by a VOD operator in Canada last week who was using, not our system unfortunately, but using one of our competitor systems. And because they knew that all of their content was always movie material, they were able to use all of those fine-grained controls to make really quite a significant difference with that tool compared to some of the other tools. But they were in the rare case of being able to control their content. So might be an interesting future thing for you to talk about, the video versus film versus
Yeah.
PC kind of world.
You know, it's interesting you bring that up. I mean, the smartest guy I know when it comes to encoding is a guy from Major League Baseball, Joe Inzerillo. And he claims that he sets up his encoders differently based upon camera location and has configurations for both night and day. So if a camera's in center field, he sets up his H.264 encoding one way. If it's at first base, he sets it up another way. And he's, you know, I believe him because he's, you know, he's done gazillions of you know, there's thousands of baseball games a year, and he's the guy in charge of encoding all of them. But beyond him, again, it's just very challenging to tie H.264 or even pre-processing options with the use case. And, you know, have you guys done it? I mean, do you have, like, film here?
Yeah, we do that for our customers. It's kind of a service thing that we do.
Okay. I mean, I'd be interested in talking to you about, you know, some general principles in that area, because I think it would be useful. But I just, you know, what I've seen is that you got a bunch of, I mean, if you look at the average user who uses compressor, and it's probably an unfair comparison, but none of them, they just use the presets. And if you talk to Squeed or Sorensen, it's like 98% of the people just use the presets because they don't know even basic configuration options. So,
Point taken, because we have a specific mode in our product that makes it look simple, because if you give full access to all the controls, it's like giving children chainsaws. It's exciting to watch, but maybe not exactly what you want.
yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you for your attention.